Welcome, dear listener. Find yourself a comfortable place to rest and let your body grow heavy and still. Take a slow, quiet breath and release any tension you might be holding. Tonight, we are going to drift together into the distant past, into ancient lands where rivers ran wide and silver under vast open skies, where the first fires of human civilization were just beginning to glow. Let the world outside grow quiet, and allow yourself simply to be carried along on the current of this gentle story. Beneath the dry and windswept soils of what we now call Iraq, buried beneath centuries of silence and sand, lie clay tablets that have waited patiently to be found. These are among the earliest written records ever produced by human hands, and what they contain is deeply unusual. Rather than simple tallies of grain or lists of rulers, many of these tablets tell a story that seems to reach far beyond the boundaries of ordinary history. They speak of beings who came from somewhere beyond the sky, of long rains and ancient floods, of knowledge passed down from those who were not quite human and not quite divine, but something altogether more difficult to categorize. This is a story woven from those very tablets, and it asks only that you listen with an open and unhurried mind. Imagine, if you will, the moment of discovery. An archaeologist crouching in the dry heat of a Mesopotamian excavation, brush in hand, clearing the dust from a surface that has not been touched since the fall of ancient empires. The tablet emerges slowly, its cuneiform impressions still crisp and readable after thousands of years of burial. Around it, the remnants of shelves and walls speak of a library that once held tens of thousands of such documents, all organized with care by scribes who understood that what they were preserving was not merely administrative record, but something far more profound, something they wished the future to know. The ancient Sumerian records, pressed carefully into soft clay and baked hard by the sun, describe a group of beings known as the Anunnaki. Their name, appearing again and again across thousands of tablets unearthed from the ruins of cities like Nippur, Ur, and Babylon, carries a meaning both simple and staggering. It translates, in essence, to those who from heaven to earth came. This phrase was not used casually. It appears in ceremonial texts, in king lists, in epic poems, and in technical records alike, as though it described a plain historical fact rather than a piece of mythology. According to these records, the Anunnaki arrived on Earth roughly 450,000 years ago, settling first in the fertile region lying between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that long green corridor of land that would later become the cradle of human civilization. The tablets describe these beings as extraordinary in their capabilities. They possessed knowledge and technology that placed them far above the early humans they encountered, and they were not simply passing through. They built cities. They established mining operations. They organized themselves into hierarchies and assigned specific duties to different members of their group. Their primary interest, according to the texts, was in extracting precious metals from the earth, particularly gold. The tablets explain that this gold was needed not for mere decoration or display, but for a deeply practical purpose. The Anunnaki required it to help sustain the atmosphere of their home world, a distant planet known in the texts as Nibiru. Whether one reads this as literal fact or as the symbolic language of an ancient mind attempting to describe something vast and unfamiliar, the consistency with which it appears across so many independent texts is quietly remarkable. The first settlements the Anunnaki established were laid out with care and purpose. The tablets describe a city called Eridu as the original point of arrival, positioned close to the Persian Gulf at a time when sea levels and river courses were quite different from what they are today. From Eridu, the settlement pattern expanded gradually northward along the river valleys. Each new city assigned a specific function within the broader Anunnaki enterprise. Bad Tibira was designated for metallurgical work. Sippar served as a center of astronomical observation. Shurupak functioned as a medical facility and administrative hub. This organized colonization of a planet, described in the tablets with the matter-of-fact tone of a company establishing branch offices, reads less like the founding mythology of a primitive culture and more like the operational records of a technologically sophisticated civilization carrying out a long-term project on a world not their own. The landscape they chose was not accidental. The region between the two great rivers offered rich alluvial soil, dependable water sources, and access to the mineral deposits of the surrounding highlands. It sat at a crossroads of continental land masses and seasonal wind patterns that made it exceptionally productive for agricultural development. The tablets suggest that the Anunnaki possessed detailed knowledge of Earth's geography before their arrival, as though their choice of settlement location had been planned through remote observation long in advance. This detail, easily overlooked in the sweep of the larger narrative, carries its own quiet weight. Among the most significant documents recovered from Nippur, the great religious center of ancient Sumer, is the Sumerian king list. This extraordinary text was part of a collection of more than 60,000 cuneiform tablets excavated from that single site alone. Tablets spanning a period from around 3500 BC all the way to 400 AD. The king list records the reigns of the very earliest rulers of Sumer, with numbers that immediately pull the reader up short. 8 kings, the text informs us, ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. All of this before a great flood swept across the earth and transformed everything. These figures are so far outside the range of normal human lifespans that most scholars have interpreted them as mythological embellishment. But another reading is possible, and the tablets seem to invite it. Perhaps these rulers were not human at all. Perhaps they were the Anunnaki themselves, or the hybrid children born of unions between Anunnaki and early human beings whose biology operated on a different timescale altogether. The names preserved in the king list carry their own resonance across the millennia. Alulim of Eridu, first among the listed rulers, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years. Alalgar, his successor, ruled for 36,000 years. These numbers follow a pattern based on the sexagesimal mathematical system that the Sumerians employed for all their most significant calculations, suggesting that whoever compiled the list was working from genuine records rather than inventing figures arbitrarily. The consistency of the mathematical framework underlying these numbers is itself a form of evidence that something real, however strange, lies behind them. The excavations conducted by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s contributed greatly to our understanding of this strange pantheon. Among the tablets he helped bring to light were detailed accounts of the Anunnaki's internal structure and leadership. The records described roughly 300 of these beings maintaining a permanent presence on Earth, while an additional 600 remained stationed somewhere above, in what the texts call the heavens. Those on the ground were organized beneath 3 primary figures. Anu, the supreme authority among them, remained largely on Nibiru and served as the distant ruler of the entire enterprise. Enlil was given command of all operations on Earth, a role he fulfilled with an iron and sometimes punishing hand. Enki, meanwhile, was designated as chief scientist and the one responsible for all matters of genetics and creation. These 3 names recur throughout the corpus of Sumerian literature, each associated with a distinct and consistent personality, a fact that suggests the tablets preserve memories of actual individuals rather than invented characters. Woolley's excavations at the Royal Cemetery of Ur revealed not only written records, but physical artifacts of astonishing sophistication. The golden headdresses, the lyres inlaid with lapis lazuli, the gaming boards constructed from materials sourced across thousands of miles of trade routes, and the elaborate funerary arrangements that accompanied the royal dead all speak of a civilization operating at a level of refinement and organizational complexity that conventional history struggles to account for, given the supposed primitiveness of the period. The wealth concentrated in these burial chambers implies surplus production on a grand scale, systematic long-distance trade, and a political structure capable of commanding enormous labor resources. All of this corresponds to what the tablets describe as the result of Anunnaki instruction and management of early human societies. The relationship between Enlil and Enki is one of the most thoroughly documented and emotionally resonant threads running through the entire Sumerian textual tradition. The two were half-brothers, the tablets tell us, and they could hardly have been more different in temperament. Enlil viewed humanity with a suspicious and often contemptuous eye. The texts describe him as deeply troubled by the noise and the growing numbers of human beings, who he regarded as unruly creatures disrupting an order he preferred to keep rigid and controlled. Enki, by contrast, felt something approaching genuine affection for humanity. He acted repeatedly as a protector of human interests, quietly defying his brother's harsh commands and sharing knowledge that Enlil would have preferred to keep locked away. This brotherly conflict, played out across thousands of years and dozens of ancient texts, became the central drama of the entire Anunnaki presence on Earth, and its consequences would ripple across every subsequent chapter of human history. There is something deeply human about this conflict, something that makes it ring true in a way that pure invention rarely does. The authoritarian leader who fears what he cannot fully control. The brilliant scientist who cannot help but share what he knows with those who need it. The tension between order and compassion, between institutional authority and individual conscience. These are not the themes of naive mythology. They are the themes of history, recognizable in every era and every culture that has left a record of its internal struggles. The fact that they appear with such consistency and such specific detail across Sumerian literature suggests that whoever recorded these stories was drawing on something that actually happened. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period and dating to approximately 1700 BC, gives us the most detailed picture of how this conflict unfolded. The story it tells is one of exponential human growth. Under Enki's patient guidance, human populations had expanded dramatically. People had learned to farm, to smelt metal, to build cities and trade goods across long distances. But this very success became a source of irritation to Enlil, who found the noise and clamor of so many human lives intolerable. The epic describes 3 separate attempts by Enlil to bring these numbers down by force. First came plagues and disease, which swept through human communities with devastating effect. But Enki intervened quietly, teaching healers and herbalists how to treat the sick, and the populations recovered. Enlil then turned to drought and famine, withholding the rains and causing crops to fail across wide regions. Again, Enki found a way around his brother's decree, instructing humans in the arts of irrigation and in methods of preserving food through the lean seasons. Time and again, Enlil's edicts were neutralized by Enki's steady, gentle countermeasures. But then came the flood. The Sumerian flood narrative predates the version most readers encounter in the Bible by more than 1,000 years, and it offers considerably more detail regarding the roles played by the Anunnaki in bringing that catastrophe about. According to the tablets, Enlil eventually brought the matter before the full council of the Anunnaki and persuaded them to approve a plan of complete annihilation. The human race had grown, he argued, too numerous and too capable, and posed a genuine threat to Anunnaki supremacy. The council agreed. A great flood would be allowed to come, one that would wipe the earth clean. Enki, bound by an oath not to warn any human being directly, found a way nonetheless. He sat beside the reed wall of a man named Utnapishtim's house and spoke aloud to the wall itself, knowing that Utnapishtim was within earshot. Through this elegant and careful deception, he passed the man everything he needed to know. Build a vessel of precise dimensions. Gather aboard it representatives of every living species. Prepare for what is coming. And so Utnapishtim did, and when the waters rose and the world as it had been known was swallowed beneath them, he and those he carried survived. The vessel described in the Atrahasis epic and elaborated upon in the Epic of Gilgamesh was not a simple boat. The tablets provide specific dimensions that describe a structure of considerable size and engineering sophistication. The craft was divided into multiple decks and compartments, sealed with bitumen against the water, and supplied with enough provisions to sustain its passengers through a period of unknown duration. The precision of these instructions, including the specific quantities of materials required, the construction sequence, and the waterproofing methods, carries the flavor of actual technical documentation rather than literary invention. Whoever composed these texts had access to detailed practical knowledge of large vessel construction, and they chose to preserve that knowledge in a narrative framework that would ensure its survival across generations. The aftermath of the flood, as described in Sumerian texts, is equally detailed. The waters receded gradually. The vessel came to rest on a mountaintop. Birds were sent out to test whether habitable land had re-emerged. Eventually the passengers disembarked, and the first thing Utnapishtim did was offer sacrifice to the gods who had preserved his life. The tablets describe how the Anunnaki gathered around the smoke of the offering, described as hovering like flies above the sacrifice, drawn by the scent after the long period of isolation during the flood itself. This peculiarly vivid detail, the gods crowding around the first post-flood fire, feels less like theological symbolism and more like an eyewitness account of beings who had spent the duration of the catastrophe somewhere else and were now returning to inspect what remained. The story of creation that the Anunnaki texts preserve is no less remarkable. The Enuma Elish, sometimes called the Babylonian creation epic, is a 7-tablet series discovered among the ruins of the great library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. Its account of how humans came to be is written in language that, when read without preconceptions, sounds less like the poetic mythology of an early civilization, and more like a description of biotechnology. The tablets explain that the Anunnaki, who had been performing all of the physical labor required by their mining and agricultural operations, eventually reached a point of exhaustion and rebellion. A workforce was needed that could take on this burden. Enki and his gifted assistant Ninmah set about the task of creating one. They extracted a particular biological essence from Anunnaki blood and combined it with what the texts call clay, a term that other tablets clarify as referring to the genetic material of the primitive hominids already living on Earth. The result of this careful and painstaking process was the first anatomically modern human being, referred to in the texts as the Adamu. The eridogenesis, another early Sumerian creation account, fills in additional details. The process was not clean or immediate. Early attempts produced beings with physical abnormalities or cognitive limitations. It took considerable time, considerable experimentation, and considerable refinement before the final design was stable and viable. This description of trial, error, and gradual perfection sounds, to a contemporary ear, uncannily like what we now know as genetic engineering. The tablets that describe Ninma's role in the creation process are particularly interesting. She is depicted as something between a chief medical officer and a laboratory director, overseeing the precise procedures that Enki designed and ensuring that each experimental specimen was evaluated carefully before the process moved forward. The texts describe how she and Enki worked through the night in what sounds remarkably like a laboratory setting, surrounded by the clay vessels containing their experimental materials. Their failures were recorded alongside their successes, lending the account a quality of scientific documentation rather than myth. The beings they produced through their early, imperfect attempts were not destroyed, but allowed to live, cared for within the Anunnaki settlement, a detail that speaks to a form of ethical consideration toward their experimental subjects that feels surprisingly contemporary. The archaeological record from Mesopotamian sites adds a further layer of strangeness to all of this. Among the artifacts recovered from sites across ancient Sumer are bronze objects containing alloy compositions of extraordinary precision. These items, some dating to 4,500 years ago, incorporate exactly calibrated ratios of tin and copper, combined with trace elements like arsenic, antimony, and silver, that optimize the material for specific uses. Achieving these ratios requires knowledge of metallurgical chemistry and the ability to maintain high smelting temperatures for sustained periods. These are not the products of accidental discovery or simple trial and error. The royal cemetery of Ur yielded gold artifacts refined to a purity exceeding 22 carats, a level of refinement that demands advanced furnace technology and a sophisticated understanding of flux materials. The copper mines of ancient Sumer included ventilation systems and drainage channels more than 100 meters below ground, equipped with bronze tools, whose hardness rivals modern steel. Everywhere one looks in the material remains of early Sumerian civilization. There is the nagging suggestion that these people had access to knowledge that ought not to have arrived yet. The tablets also describe flying vehicles. They are called, in different texts, divine boats of heaven and whirlwind birds, and their capabilities are described in terms that have prompted some researchers to compare them to modern aircraft. Small golden objects recovered from various Mesopotamian sites have been interpreted by some as scale models of winged vehicles, complete with what appear to be stabilizing fins and cockpit structures. Dating to approximately 1000 BC, these artifacts suggest that whoever made them was familiar with the principles of aerodynamic design, principles that conventional history would place many centuries in the future. The great ziggurats of Sumer present their own architectural puzzles. These massive step temples required precise mathematical planning, sophisticated engineering knowledge, and mechanisms for lifting enormous stone blocks to considerable heights. The great ziggurat of Ur, reconstructed during the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC, originally stood more than 60 feet tall and covered a base area of roughly 150 by 200 feet. Its stonework was fitted with extraordinary care, and its internal drainage systems demonstrate practical engineering of a high order. The construction of these ziggurats represents an organizational achievement as impressive as the technical one. Thousands of laborers would have been required, coordinated across years of sustained effort, fed and housed and managed through systems of supply and administration that imply governmental structures of considerable sophistication. The tablets that describe the building of these structures include what appear to be project management records, detailing the quantities of materials required, the numbers of workers assigned to different tasks, and the timelines expected for each phase of construction. Reading these records, one feels the presence of minds accustomed to managing complexity on a large scale, minds for whom the coordination of massive collective effort was a familiar and well-understood challenge. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Sumerian tablets is perhaps the most quietly astonishing of all their achievements. The tablets describe the solar system's planetary orbits with a completeness that includes bodies like Neptune and Uranus, which cannot be seen with the naked eye. They record the synodic period of Venus as 584 days, a figure that differs from our own precise modern measurement by less than half a day. They describe Mars's apparent retrograde motion against the background of fixed stars, and explain this phenomenon using geometric models that account for Earth's own orbital movement relative to the outer planets. These explanations reflect something very close to a heliocentric understanding of the solar system, an understanding that conventional history does not credit to any civilization until many centuries later. The Mul-Apin tablets, discovered at multiple Mesopotamian sites and dating to approximately 1000 BC, contain star catalogues and systematic records of celestial observations that clearly represent the accumulated work of many generations of careful astronomers. These texts organize 66 stars and constellations into 3 celestial pathways, each associated with one of the 3 primary Anunnaki deities. They record the helical risings and settings of major stars with precision sufficient to track seasonal cycles for agricultural planning. Their calculations of the 19-year lunar cycle, containing 235 lunar months, produce calendar accuracy within hours of modern measurements. Their understanding of the precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle by which the vernal equinox gradually shifts through the zodiacal constellations, is recorded with mathematical precision that modern astronomy confirms. The observatories from which this knowledge was gathered remain in their architectural bones, partially visible at several Mesopotamian sites. The upper platforms of ziggurats, oriented with careful precision toward specific points on the horizon, served as elevated observation platforms from which trained astronomers could track the movements of celestial bodies against consistent reference markers. The tablets describe the instruments used at these platforms, including water clocks of remarkable accuracy that allowed observers to time the rising and setting of stars to within minutes, and sighting tubes that functioned as primitive but effective telescopes for improving the resolution of naked eye observations. The level of sustained institutional commitment required to produce the accumulated astronomical database reflected in the Mul-Apin tablets implies observational programs spanning multiple generations, maintained through political upheavals and civilizational changes with a continuity that itself speaks to the profound importance placed on this knowledge by those who held it. And woven through all of this astronomical knowledge is the persistent reference to a 12th body in our solar system, the home world of the Anunnaki, described in the tablets as Nibiru. This world, the texts explain, follows a highly elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system once every 3,600 years, a period the Sumerians designated as one Sar. During these periodic approaches, Nibiru becomes visible as a reddish object in Earth's skies, and its gravitational presence produces measurable effects on the other bodies of the solar system. The tablets describe its farthest point as extending well beyond even Pluto's orbit, while its closest approach brings it into the region between Mars and Jupiter. Whether this body exists in the physical sense remains a matter of active debate, but the consistency and mathematical detail of its description across so many cuneiform sources is difficult to dismiss as pure imagination. The tablets that describe Nibiru's characteristics do so with the tone of factual record rather than poetic elaboration. They note its color, its brightness at closest approach, its effects on atmospheric conditions during near passages, and the specific stellar configurations against which it can be identified as it moves through the inner solar system. These are the notes of observers, not dreamers. The mathematical framework underlying the 3,600-year orbital period is consistent with the sexagesimal calculation system that pervades all Sumerian astronomy, further suggesting that this number was derived from actual observation and calculation rather than selected for symbolic significance. The Sumerian astronomical tradition found echoes and inheritors across the ancient world. The Babylonians who came after elaborated and refined the same frameworks. The Greeks absorbed this knowledge through their own scholars who traveled to Mesopotamia and returned with the understanding that celestial mechanics followed mathematical laws. Sumerian eclipse prediction records contain dates that match precisely with computer-generated eclipse cycles for the 3rd millennium BC. Their understanding of the Saros cycle, the 18-year period governing the recurrence of eclipses, was sophisticated enough to enable predictions of eclipse visibility across different geographic regions with accuracy that modern software confirms. The tablet archives at Nippur in Babylon contained not only astronomical records, but systematic correlations between celestial events and terrestrial conditions, a discipline that the Sumerians pursued with the same rigor they applied to their mathematical and engineering work. These correlations, preserved in the massive omen series known as Enuma Anu Enlil, represent decades of comparative observation, noting which celestial configurations consistently preceded drought, which preceded flooding, which preceded political upheaval, and which preceded periods of prosperity. Whatever one makes of the underlying theory, the observational database from which these correlations were derived was genuine and extensive, and the patterns it captured were real enough to be useful for practical planning across many generations of agricultural and administrative decision-making. The medical knowledge preserved in Sumerian clay and Egyptian papyrus adds yet another layer to this picture of unexpected capability. The Edwin Smith papyrus, dating to approximately 1600 BC, contains surgical descriptions of remarkable specificity, including trepanation procedures performed with instruments designed to minimize tissue damage and infection. Sumerian medical tablets describe organ transplant procedures, along with pharmaceutical formulations for managing immune rejection, using plant and mineral compounds that modern pharmacology recognizes as possessing genuine immunosuppressive properties. The complexity of these medical procedures implies knowledge that conventional history would not credit to any civilization until the 20th century. The herbal pharmacopoeia, preserved in Sumerian medical texts, is itself a remarkable document of biological knowledge. The tablets list hundreds of plant and mineral compounds with specific applications for different medical conditions, along with detailed instructions for preparation, dosage, and administration. Modern analysis of these formulations has confirmed the efficacy of a surprising number of them, identifying active compounds in the specified plants that do indeed produce the therapeutic effects the tablets claim. This is not accidental correspondence. It represents systematic empirical investigation of biological systems conducted over long periods of careful observation and recording, a tradition of medical science that the Sumerian texts attribute directly to the instruction of Ninmah and other Anunnaki specialists in biological knowledge. The ancient texts of cultures far removed from Sumer reflect strikingly similar themes and figures. The Egyptian Neteru, as described in hieroglyphic inscriptions from the pyramid texts and the coffin texts, serve roles almost identical to those of the Anunnaki. They traverse dimensions, operate vessels described as boats of millions of years, and maintain selective breeding programs to produce lineages of hybrid descent. The Turin King list describes the Neteru ruling Egypt for tens of thousands of years, before gradually handing governance over to human pharaohs who claimed divine ancestry. The Palermo stone from the 5th dynasty records the reigns of pre-dynastic rulers with lifespan stretching across millennia, mirroring the extraordinary numbers found in the Sumerian king list. The Edfu building texts, carved on the walls of the Temple of Horus, describe how a group of divine beings called the Sages arrived in Egypt following the destruction of their original homeland by flooding, traveling to the Nile Valley, and establishing temple complexes as repositories of their scientific and spiritual knowledge. The Egyptian texts that deal with the figure of Thoth are particularly relevant to this broader picture. Thoth was credited in hieroglyphic tradition with the invention of writing, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, all the foundational disciplines of civilization attributed to a single divine being who existed before the human race in its current form. The texts describe Thoth as having recorded all the knowledge of the gods in a great library kept hidden from ordinary human access, available only to those with sufficient preparation and worthiness to receive it. This narrative of a divine repository of forbidden or protected knowledge appears with remarkable consistency across ancient cultures, each describing a similar pattern of celestial beings arriving, sharing carefully selected portions of their knowledge with chosen human recipients, and withholding the most powerful elements for reasons that the texts connect to concerns about human misuse. The Hindu scriptures offer equally striking parallels. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana describe aerial vehicles known as vimanas, capable of traveling between worlds, deployed by various divine factions during cosmic wars that left landscapes devastated and uninhabitable for generations. The weapons they describe, called Brahmastra and Agnyastra, produce effects that closely resemble those of nuclear detonations. The Puranas describe cyclical destructions and recreation spanning millions of years, with the Devas serving as guardians and manipulators of human development throughout these immense time periods. The Rig Veda contains hymns describing what sound, unmistakably, like genetic experiments conducted by divine beings on early humans, using language of mixing and combining divine essence with earthly substance to produce improved human specimens. The Vishnu Purana describes how the Devas established specific bloodlines within the human population, creating dynasties of hybrid rulers who claimed descent from solar and lunar deities, and maintained power through this alleged divine heritage. The Mahabharata's account of the Kurukshetra war deserves particular attention in this context. The text describes a conflict of such destructive scale that it left entire regions of the subcontinent uninhabitable, with survivors reporting symptoms that modern readers recognize as consistent with radiation exposure, including hair loss, skin lesions, and contamination of water sources. The weapons deployed during this war are described with technical specificity that goes far beyond the literary conventions of ancient heroic poetry. Their effects are measured in terms of areas destroyed, populations eliminated, and environmental damage lasting for generations. Whether one interprets this as memory of an actual ancient conflict involving advanced technology, as literary elaboration of historical warfare, or as something else entirely, The precision and consistency of the technical descriptions is difficult to explain away through simple poetic license. Greek tradition preserves a version of the same underlying story through the Titans, those primordial beings who governed the world during the Golden Age before the Olympian gods displaced them. Hesiod's Theogony describes them as possessing vast knowledge and the power to reshape natural forces, capable of producing hybrid offspring with human partners. The figure of Prometheus, who defied the higher gods to give fire to humanity, occupies exactly the same narrative position as Enki in the Sumerian tradition. The benevolent insider who breaks ranks with the divine hierarchy to advance the cause of human beings. The Orphic hymns and fragments of lost texts describe the cosmic conflict that followed, in which the Titans were defeated and imprisoned in the underworld, where they continued to exert influence over human affairs from their captivity. The myth of Atlantis, preserved most completely in the dialogues of Plato, but referenced in older Egyptian sources that Plato himself acknowledged as his informants, fits naturally within this broader pattern of divine civilizations preceding the current human era. Plato's account describes a technologically advanced island civilization of enormous power and complexity that vanished beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic day and night. The Egyptians who told the story to Solon, and through him to Plato, described it not as legend, but as historical record, preserved in their temple archives across a span of 9,000 years. The Atlanteans, in Plato's telling, were the descendants of a union between the god Poseidon and a mortal woman, a hybrid lineage that gave them capabilities beyond normal human limits, but also the moral flaws that eventually led to their destruction. The geographical details Plato provides, the location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the system of concentric rings of land and water, the metallic compound called orichalcum that was mined there and used for architectural facing. All of these specifics suggest access to a source of genuine historical information rather than purely invented narrative. The Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopian manuscripts and among the fragments discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls, provides an account of divine intervention in human affairs that stands remarkably close to the Sumerian originals despite originating in a very different cultural context. 200 beings called the Watchers, the text tells us, descended to Mount Hermon around 3000 BC under the leadership of Semjaza and Azazel. They took human companions and produced offspring of enormous size and strength called the Nephilim, whose violent and insatiable behavior eventually prompted a divine decision to cleanse the earth through a global flood. The Watchers, before their punishment, had taught humans the arts of metallurgy, medicine, cosmetics, weaponry, and astronomical calculation. This transfer of knowledge was described as unauthorized, something done against the explicit wishes of higher divine powers, and it resulted in the Watchers' eventual imprisonment and judgment. The physical descriptions of the Watchers in these texts are consistent across multiple independent sources. They were tall beyond human norm, with luminous skin, unusually large eyes, and the ability to shift between physical and more ethereal states of being. Their technology included fire-bright aerial vehicles and communication systems that allowed instantaneous contact across vast distances. These descriptions have drawn persistent comparisons to modern accounts of unidentified aerial phenomena and their occupants, a parallel that grows more interesting the more closely it is examined. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Genesis Apocryphon describes the birth of Noah in terms that suggest he was not entirely a normal human child. His father Lamech was reportedly troubled by the child's appearance at birth, noting that his skin was white as snow, that his eyes filled the room with light, and that his hair was as white as wool. These characteristics, so far outside the range of normal human variation, prompted Lamech to fear that the child had actually been fathered by one of the Watchers, rather than by himself. The Book of Giants, another Qumran text recovered in fragmentary form, describes the Nephilim in harrowing detail, noting their superhuman size and strength and the devastating effect their appetites had on the world around them. When ordinary food sources proved insufficient, the text recounts, these beings turned to consuming human flesh and blood, a development that contributed to the divine decision to send the flood. The Qumran community that preserved these texts was itself remarkable. Living in deliberate isolation in the desert near the Dead Sea, these scholars maintained a library of texts spanning an extraordinary range of theological, astronomical, and prophetic material. The sheer breadth of what they chose to preserve suggests that they understood themselves as custodians of knowledge that the broader world was not ready to receive, or that might not survive the turbulence of the era they were living through. The cave in which the scrolls were discovered had been sealed with great care. The pottery jars that contained the manuscripts wrapped in linen to protect them from moisture and sealed against the desert air. Someone had taken considerable trouble to ensure that these texts would still be readable when whoever came looking finally arrived. The physical evidence left behind by ancient builders across the globe speaks its own strange language. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, constructed roughly 9,500 years before the Common Era, predates Stonehenge by more than 6 millennia, and demonstrates a level of astronomical knowledge and artistic sophistication that challenges every assumption about the pace of early human development. The site's massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 16 tons, are arranged in circular patterns that align with specific stellar configurations. Their surfaces are carved with images of animals, humanoid figures, and abstract symbols executed with a precision that exceeds what we would expect from the simple tools available to Neolithic communities. Several of the animals depicted were not native to the region during the site's period of construction, raising questions about how the builders came by their knowledge of distant fauna. Perhaps most intriguing of all is what happened to the site around 8000 BC. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Enormous quantities of earth and debris were intentionally heaped over the entire complex, preserving it with extraordinary effectiveness for future discovery. The labor required for this burial was at least as significant as that required for construction, and the reasons behind it remain deeply unclear. The question of who built Göbekli Tepe is itself deeply puzzling. The conventional archaeological timeline places this site in the late Paleolithic or very early Neolithic period, at a time when the inhabitants of the region were supposed to have been simple hunter-gatherers with no settled communities and no organized religion. Yet the site required sustained collective effort, division of labor, centralized coordination, and a sophisticated symbolic system shared across a community large enough to mobilize the required workforce. Either our understanding of the pace of cultural development in this period is fundamentally wrong, or Göbekli Tepe was built by people whose capabilities far exceeded what their era should have allowed. Neither possibility is comfortable for conventional archaeology, and both invite further questions about what or who might have been guiding or accelerating the development of these early human communities. Baalbek in Lebanon offers another order of mystery altogether. Its foundation stones include individual limestone blocks weighing up to 800 tons, positioned with a precision that modern construction equipment would struggle to replicate. The three great blocks known as the Trilithon, each measuring roughly 65 feet in length, 14 feet in height, and 12 feet in width, represent among the largest work stones in the entire human record. In the quarry nearby lies a block known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, partially cut from the bedrock and weighing an estimated 1,000 tons. The cutting marks on this stone are precise and clean, and no one has yet offered a fully convincing explanation of how it was intended to be moved. The structures above these foundations align with specific astronomical events, suggesting that the site served purposes extending well beyond religious ceremony. The Romans, who built their own extensive temples at Baalbek during the imperial period, were fully aware that they were constructing atop foundations they had not made and could not fully explain. Roman engineers of the 1st and 2nd centuries AAD, who were among the most capable builders in the ancient world, chose to incorporate the pre-existing megalithic stones into their own structures rather than remove or replace them. This decision implies that the Roman builders recognized the quality and precision of the earlier work as exceeding their own capabilities, and elected to build upon it rather than attempt to match it. This quiet acknowledgement by some of history's greatest engineers that someone before them had surpassed their abilities is itself a form of testimony to the extraordinary nature of what they found at Baalbek. Sacsayhuaman, the great fortress complex overlooking Cusco in Peru, presents a different but equally arresting set of puzzles. Its 3 terrace walls are built from limestone blocks fitted together so tightly that despite the absence of any mortar, a knife blade cannot be slid between them. Many of these blocks exceed 100 tons in weight, and their surfaces are smoothed and angled with a perfection that implies tools of extraordinary hardness and precision, none of which have been found at the site. The Inca themselves attributed the construction of Sacsayhuaman to beings called the Viracocha, divine figures who were said to have possessed the ability to soften stone and shape it as easily as clay, working through the application of specific sound frequencies. The legends surrounding the Viracocha are worth dwelling on. These beings are described across multiple Andean traditions as tall, fair-skinned figures who arrived in the region following a great catastrophe and immediately set about teaching the local population the arts of civilization, agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and governance. After establishing the foundations of what would become the Inca civilization, they departed across the ocean, promising to return. The similarity of this narrative to accounts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other ancient cultures of divine teachers arriving after a catastrophe, sharing foundational knowledge, and then departing with a promise of eventual return, is one of those convergences that becomes harder to dismiss the more carefully it is examined. Pumapunku in Bolivia takes this strangeness still further. Its andesite and diorite blocks are cut with a precision that rivals modern machine tooling, incorporating perfectly flat surfaces, exact right angles, and complex 3-dimensional interlocking joints designed to resist the shifting stresses of seismic activity. These stones were quarried from sources several miles distant and transported by methods that remain genuinely unexplained. The H-shaped blocks that characterize the site interlock in all 3 dimensions, creating structural systems of considerable sophistication. The tools needed to produce such work would have to be harder than the stone itself, and yet no such tools have been found anywhere near the site. The site at Pumapunku shows evidence of having been catastrophically destroyed at some point in the past. Its carefully assembled stone components thrown about as though by an enormous force and left where they fell. The scale of this destruction suggests either a massive seismic event or something more deliberately violent. Local traditions speak of the site being destroyed in a great war of the gods, a conflict between divine factions that left the landscape scarred, and the carefully built structures in ruins. This narrative of divine conflict resulting in physical destruction correlates with accounts from Sumerian, Hindu, and other ancient traditions of cosmic wars between different factions of advanced beings, wars that left detectable traces in the physical environment. The flood narratives of isolated cultures around the world form perhaps the most compelling body of evidence for shared historical memory. More than 200 distinct traditions, from civilizations that had no contact with one another, describe a catastrophic global deluge with strikingly consistent features. In every version, some form of divine displeasure motivates the flood. In every version, selected individuals receive advance warning and survive through careful preparation. In every version, the survivors are distinguished from the rest of humanity by specific qualities, genetic, moral, or spiritual, that make them worth preserving. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical flood narrative by more than a millennium, describes in precise technical detail how Utnapishtim was instructed by Ea to build a vessel of specific dimensions and to load it with representatives of every living species. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes how Vishnu's fish avatar saved Manu and a carefully chosen group of survivors from a cosmic deluge, preserving specific bloodlines for their compatibility with future divine plans. Hopi oral tradition describes how the ant people led chosen humans into underground chambers for safety, and how they emerged afterward under divine guidance to begin the world again. This convergence of specific narrative elements across unconnected traditions points more toward a shared historical event than toward independent mythological invention. The geological evidence for a catastrophic global flooding event approximately 11,000 years ago is itself substantial and widely accepted within mainstream science. The end of the last ice age involved a period of rapid and dramatic sea level rise as the great northern ice sheets melted, a process that geologists have shown occurred in several sudden pulses, rather than as a smooth and gradual transition. The most dramatic of these pulses, sometimes called Meltwater Pulse 1A, may have involved sea level rises of several meters, occurring within a matter of centuries or even decades, more than sufficient to inundate low-lying coastal regions where human populations were concentrated. The catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea Basin, the Persian Gulf, and the lowlands of Southeast Asia during this period would have been experienced by the peoples living in those regions as precisely the kind of world-ending deluge described in flood traditions worldwide. The survivors who carried memories of these events would have integrated them into their oral traditions, and those traditions, transmitted across generations, eventually became the written records we now read in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bible, the Puranas, and the Popol Vuh. The Baghdad Battery, discovered in 1936 by the German archaeologist Wilhelm König near Baghdad, offers one of the most thought-provoking examples of ancient technological sophistication in the material record. This clay jar, dating to approximately 250 BC during the Parthian period, contains a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod, with the two metals separated and held in place by an asphalt stopper. When the jar is filled with an acidic liquid such as vinegar, the device generates approximately 1.1 volts of electrical current. Koenig identified similar devices at multiple Mesopotamian archaeological sites, and chemical analysis of residues inside several specimens revealed traces of acidic substances consistent with their function as galvanic cells. The copper cylinders show corrosion patterns characteristic of electrolytic reactions, while the iron rods carry oxidation signatures that develop specifically during electrical current generation. Gold-plated objects from Mesopotamian sites display coating thicknesses that are highly uniform, a characteristic of electroplating rather than the irregular surfaces produced by traditional fire gilding methods, suggesting that electrical deposition techniques were being applied systematically across multiple generations of craftsmen. The implications of functional electrochemical cells in ancient Mesopotamia extend far beyond simple curiosity about one unusual artifact. If electrical generation was understood and applied as a practical technology during the Parthian period, the question immediately arises of when this knowledge originated. The Parthian civilization was itself a successor to much older Mesopotamian traditions, inheriting knowledge from Babylonian, Assyrian, and ultimately Sumerian predecessors. If galvanic cell technology was in practical use in 250 BC, how much earlier might the underlying principles have been understood? The tablets that describe advanced Anunnaki technology as the source of early Mesopotamian scientific knowledge take on a different quality when placed alongside physical evidence of electrical applications that conventional history has no framework for explaining. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt contains carved reliefs that have generated sustained discussion among those who notice their resemblance to electrical technology. Elongated, bulb-shaped objects connected to cable-like structures leading to rectangular box-shaped devices are depicted with figures who appear to be operating them. Inside the bulb shapes, serpentine forms suggest electrical discharges or plasma in a low-pressure environment, and the narrow necks of these objects correspond closely to the construction of cathode tubes. Chemical analysis of the temple walls in areas depicted as being lit by these devices reveals surfaces free of soot, contrasting sharply with the heavy carbon deposits found in parts of the temple illuminated by conventional torches. The hieroglyphic inscriptions accompanying these images use terms that translate to phrases like light of Ra and the illumination of the sacred chambers, suggesting a functional rather than merely decorative or ceremonial purpose. The Dendra reliefs exist within a broader context of Egyptian technical knowledge that consistently surprises researchers who approach it without preconceptions. The precision of Egyptian stonework at its finest, particularly in the Old Kingdom period, involves tolerances that match modern machine surfaces. Granite blocks in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid have been measured with laser equipment and found to vary from perfect flatness by no more than a few thousandths of an inch across surfaces many feet in length. The internal corners of the granite coffer in the same chamber are cut to right angles with a precision that was not surpassed by Western manufacturing technology until the Industrial Revolution. These achievements were not produced by primitive copper tools and human muscle alone, regardless of how many laborers were available. They imply access to materials and methods that the conventional archaeological record has not yet fully accounted for. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the most examined structure in all of human history, contains architectural details that some researchers interpret as evidence of electrical generation capabilities integrated into its fundamental design. Its internal chambers incorporate granite components with high quartz content, and quartz exhibits piezoelectric properties, generating an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress. The King's Chamber positions its granite sarcophagus at the chamber's acoustic resonant node, where vibrations achieve maximum amplitude. Electromagnetic surveys of the pyramid have detected unusual conductivity patterns within its stone, particularly in regions containing metallic inclusions. The air shafts, long assumed to have religious significance, maintain perfectly constant cross-sectional areas throughout their lengths, requiring advanced surveying and construction planning to achieve. They point with great precision towards specific stellar positions. The pole star as it stood circa 2500 BC in one direction, the belt of Orion in another, alignments too exact to be accidental. The Great Pyramid's relationship to geography has attracted considerable attention from researchers who note that it sits at the precise intersection of the longest line of latitude and the longest line of longitude that pass over land on the surface of the Earth. This positioning, at the exact center of the Earth's landmass when measured in these terms, would have required comprehensive knowledge of world geography and the mathematics of spherical trigonometry to achieve. The builders of the Great Pyramid, working around 2500 BC by conventional dating, are not supposed to have possessed either the geographical knowledge of distant continents or the mathematical tools required for this kind of global calculation. And yet there the structure stands, at precisely that location, oriented to true north to within a fraction of a degree, its dimensions encoding mathematical constants, including the value of pi and the golden ratio in relationships too precise to be coincidental. The mathematical tablets of ancient Sumer preserve computational achievements of comparable sophistication. The Plimpton 322 tablet, dating to around 1800 BC, contains tables of Pythagorean triples demonstrating a full and working understanding of geometric relationships that would conventionally be attributed to Greek mathematics many centuries later. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, operating in base 60, facilitated astronomical calculations and architectural measurements with a precision that continues to influence our own mathematics in the number of minutes in an hour and the number of degrees in a circle. The ancient texts that describe flying vehicles, from Sumerian epics to Sanskrit technical manuals, carry this same flavor of specificity and technical detail. The Vaimanika Shastra provides construction specifications for multiple types of aerial craft, including details of their propulsion systems, materials of construction, and operational characteristics. The Mercury vortex propulsion system it describes has drawn the interest of researchers who note that Mercury plasma does exhibit unusual electromagnetic behavior under specific conditions. Ezekiel's description of the vehicle he encountered contains details that puzzle anyone who approaches it with technical curiosity. Wheels within wheels rotating in perfect coordination suggest gyroscopic stabilization. The sounds he describes, like the noise of great waters and the voice of the Almighty, imply powerful propulsion. The landing sequence he narrates includes retractable support structures that adjust to uneven ground. The beings he observes wear reflective garments and carry what appear to be communication and scanning devices. Taken together, these details read less like visionary symbolism and more like the account of someone attempting to describe, in the only language available to him, machinery he genuinely witnessed but lacked the framework to fully comprehend. The prophet Ezekiel was writing in the 6th century BC, during the Babylonian exile of the Hebrew people, in an environment saturated with the cuneiform traditions of Mesopotamia. His account draws on a cultural context deeply familiar with the Anunnaki narratives of Sumerian literature, and yet his description of the divine vehicle he encountered contains specific technical details that go beyond anything found in the Sumerian texts, suggesting that he was not simply reproducing a literary convention, but recording a genuine personal experience filtered through the conceptual vocabulary available to him. The consistency of his technical descriptions, maintained across several separate accounts in the text of the book that bears his name, further supports the impression of authentic eyewitness testimony rather than literary invention. The ancient medical texts reinforce this impression of knowledge that arrived in cultures before those cultures should have had the means to develop it. Organ transplant procedures described in Sumerian tablets, brain surgery techniques detailed in Egyptian papyri, pharmaceutical compounds for managing immune responses, all of these point toward a body of medical understanding that conventional history would place far later in time. The surgical instruments recovered from ancient Egyptian sites include bronze scalpels with blade angles optimized for specific tissue types, forceps designed to minimize damage, and graduated probes for measuring surgical depth, all executed at metallurgical standards that exceed typical Bronze Age production. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Greek shipwreck of approximately 100 BC, stands as perhaps the single most dramatic example of ancient mechanical complexity yet discovered. This bronze device calculates planetary movements and predicts eclipses across multiple long cycles, including the 19-year Metonic cycle and the 223-month Saros eclipse cycle, using differential gears and epicyclic gear trains, machined to tolerances that represent a breathtaking level of mechanical precision. The sophistication of its gear ratios reflects understanding of planetary orbital relationships that the conventional historical timeline attributes to much later developments. The discovery of the Antikythera mechanism in 1901 fundamentally altered scholarly understanding of ancient mechanical capability, yet its implications have never been fully integrated into the broader historical narrative. If a device of this complexity existed in the 1st century BC, the accumulated engineering knowledge required to design and manufacture it must have developed over a very long period of incremental refinement. Mechanical devices of this sophistication do not appear suddenly from nothing. They represent the peak of a tradition, and that tradition's earlier stages have left little physical trace in the archaeological record. The Antikythera mechanism stands alone, without clear predecessors, as though it materialized from a knowledge tradition that was otherwise carefully hidden or has been entirely lost to time. Across the world's ancient civilizations, these patterns of unexpected sophistication appear consistently in contexts associated with divine intervention narratives. The texts that describe gods descending from the sky correlate with archaeological sites demonstrating construction capabilities beyond normal human means. The medical knowledge attributed to divine instruction correlates with surgical techniques that modern medicine recognizes as genuine. The astronomical precision attributed to gods who revealed the secrets of the heavens correlates with calculations that our own instruments confirm as accurate. Whether one interprets all of this as evidence of literal extraterrestrial contact, as the product of a now vanished human civilization that achieved technological heights before a global catastrophe erased the record, or as something else entirely, the convergence is real, and it is difficult to look away from. The prophetic literature preserved within Sumerian cuneiform texts adds a temporal dimension to this picture. The tablets describe recurring cycles of divine return and evaluation, timed to the orbital period of Nibiru, and spaced roughly 3,600 years apart. In these texts, each return of the Anunnaki brings an assessment of human progress and a series of interventions designed to correct whatever has gone wrong, genetically, spiritually, or technologically, since the previous visit. The tablets describe specific astronomical markers that precede these intervention periods. Unusual planetary alignments, the appearance of a reddish celestial object growing brighter, meteor showers, atmospheric disturbances, and auroral displays in regions where they are not normally seen. These celestial warnings were understood by the trained priesthood as indicators that the time of crossing was approaching. The Sumerian priesthood that maintained this astronomical knowledge was itself a remarkable institution. Selected for their intellectual capabilities and trained from childhood in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the arts of sacred writing, these individuals served as the custodians of a knowledge tradition that stretched back to what the tablets describe as direct Anunnaki instruction. Their training involved not only the intellectual mastery of vast bodies of recorded information, but also the cultivation of specific states of consciousness through meditation, ritual, and physical disciplines designed to enhance perceptual and intuitive capabilities. The ziggurat temples in which they worked were not merely places of worship, but functioning centers of research, education, and administration, staffed by specialists in different branches of a comprehensive knowledge system. The lamentation texts of ancient Sumer, a genre of poetic literature that records the fall of great cities and civilizations, contain astronomical descriptions that correspond with the warning signs described in the prophetic texts. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur describes unusual celestial phenomena accompanying the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, around 2000 BC, including the appearance of a great star that turned the daylight to shadow, and the sound of thunder from clear skies that preceded the arrival of destructive forces from the east. These descriptions correlate with the kind of atmospheric and acoustic effects that would accompany the approach of a large cometary, or asteroidal body passing close to Earth, and their preservation within a formally structured literary genre suggests that the scribes who composed these texts were recording genuine observations rather than employing conventional poetic imagery. The Omen tablets, known as Enuma Anu Enlil, a comprehensive collection spanning 70 tablets, present systematic correlations between specific celestial configurations and terrestrial events across thousands of years of accumulated observation. The mathematical precision of these correlations is striking. The tablets describe formulas for predicting how particular stellar positions will relate to earthly outcomes, creating frameworks that were used for centuries of astrological and astronomical calculation. Whether one accepts or rejects the premise of an extraterrestrial return cycle, the sophistication of the observational and mathematical system underlying these texts is genuinely impressive. The Kolbrin Bible, a collection of ancient texts preserved by Celtic monks and claiming pre-Christian Egyptian and Hebrew origins, describes a celestial body called the Destroyer that follows a long elliptical orbit and brings periodic catastrophe to Earth through gravitational disruption, atmospheric disturbance, and electromagnetic interference. The text provides specific chronological frameworks that align with the 3,600-year cycle described in Mesopotamian sources, and it attributes past catastrophes of historical scale, including the destruction of Atlantis and the disruptions associated with the Exodus, to previous approaches of this body. It appears as a bright copper-colored object, growing larger as it nears, accompanied by a debris trail that generates meteor showers and atmospheric effects. The traditions of the Hopi people of the American Southwest preserve a cyclical cosmology that bears remarkable structural resemblance to both the Sumerian and Kolbrin accounts. The Hopi described the current era as the Fourth World, preceded by 3 previous world ages, each of which was destroyed through a different form of catastrophe: fire, ice, and flood. The transition between world ages is associated in Hopi tradition with the return of Sakwasohu, the blue star Kachina, a celestial visitor whose appearance signals the end of one world and the beginning of another. The Hopi elders who have spoken publicly about this tradition describe it as prophetic knowledge maintained across many generations, specifically for the purpose of preparing those who hold it for the challenges of the world transition period. The structural parallels between this tradition and the Sumerian prophetic frameworks, across a geographic and cultural distance that should preclude any direct connection, constitute one of those convergences that simple coincidence struggles to explain. The Emerald Tablets, attributed to Thoth Hermes and preserved through alchemical manuscripts across medieval Europe, describe great cycles governing the rise and fall of civilizations in language that is symbolic but consistent in its underlying mathematics. They speak of lords of light who periodically return to evaluate human development and implement corrective guidance when civilizations stray from their intended evolutionary pathways. The metaphorical framework of these texts has been interpreted as a deliberate concealment strategy, designed to preserve technical information about astronomical cycles and genetic enhancement in a form that would survive without being fully understood by those not prepared to use it. The tradition of esoteric knowledge preservation through symbolic encoding runs through the intellectual history of every major civilization. The mystery schools of ancient Greece, the Hermetic traditions of Egypt, the Kabbalistic schools of the Hebrew world, the Sufi orders of Islamic civilization, and the alchemical brotherhoods of medieval Europe all maintained bodies of knowledge that they considered too powerful or too easily misused for general distribution, wrapping their most important teachings in layers of symbolic language accessible only to those who had undergone specific preparation and demonstrated the necessary qualities of character and understanding. The consistency of this pattern across cultures that developed largely independently of one another suggests that all of these traditions were responding to the same underlying challenge: how to preserve knowledge that must be kept safe until the conditions for its proper use are established. Modern research has produced findings that some interpret as corroborating the Sumerian accounts in unexpected ways. Human chromosome number 2 shows clear evidence of an ancient fusion between two separate chromosomes that remain distinct in other primates, a modification that appears to have occurred abruptly rather than through gradual evolutionary change. Human mitochondrial DNA reveals a population bottleneck approximately 70,000 years ago, when the entire human species narrowed to fewer than 10,000 individuals worldwide, a number consistent with ancient accounts of selective preservation of particular genetic lineages. The FOXP2 gene, which governs certain aspects of language and cognitive function, shows variations in populations whose ancestry traces to ancient Mesopotamian regions that correlate with enhanced linguistic and pattern recognition abilities. Genetic research conducted since the mapping of the human genome has also revealed that certain segments of human DNA have no clear antecedents in any other primate genome, appearing as though inserted from an external source rather than accumulated through the gradual processes of natural selection. These so-called orphan genes, sequences that seem to have no evolutionary predecessors, are found across many species but appear with particular frequency in the human genome. Conventional genetics attributes them to horizontal gene transfer or to the rapid evolution of previously non-functional DNA sequences, but neither explanation fully accounts for the precision and functionality of many of these orphan sequences. Some researchers have begun to describe this as the most important unsolved problem in evolutionary biology, and the Sumerian account of deliberate genetic modification of early humans by technically sophisticated beings offers at minimum a thought-provoking alternative framework. The development of CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology since 2012 has given contemporary scientists the ability to make the kinds of targeted, heritable modifications to human DNA that Sumerian tablets attribute to Anunnaki genetic engineers. The completion of the Human Genome Project in 2003 revealed the full complexity of the architecture that any such intervention would have had to work with. The exponential development of artificial intelligence systems, quantum computing, and space exploration capabilities has brought human technological achievements to a point that ancient texts, interpreted through this particular lens, describe as the threshold conditions for renewed contact. The rapid acceleration of human technological development over the past 2 centuries, and particularly over the past few decades, is itself a phenomenon that invites reflection in the context of these ancient narratives. The Sumerian texts describe a pattern of Anunnaki intervention that involves periods of active instruction followed by withdrawal, allowing the implanted knowledge to develop organically within human civilization until the next visit. The current rate of acceleration, compressing into decades what previously required centuries, suggests either a natural culmination of the accumulated developmental momentum or the beginning of a new phase in a longer cycle whose parameters were set long ago by minds other than our own. Astronomical surveys of the outer solar system continue to detect gravitational anomalies affecting the orbits of the outermost planets in ways that suggest undiscovered mass concentrations beyond Neptune's orbit. Object 2014, UN-271, discovered by the Dark Energy Survey, measures approximately 100 kilometers across and follows a highly elliptical orbit that carries it from the outer reaches of the solar system toward the inner planets on a cycle of approximately 612 years, originating from the Oort cloud in a trajectory that deviates from standard asteroid belt dynamics. The Catalina Sky Survey has identified multiple objects whose trajectories show modifications inconsistent with known gravitational influences, while NASA's Neowise mission has documented thermal signatures from several asteroids that suggest internal heat sources exceeding levels possible through radioactive decay alone. The search for Planet 9, the hypothetical large body whose gravitational influence is inferred from the anomalous clustering of distant trans-Neptunian objects, has occupied a growing number of professional astronomers in recent years. The mathematical evidence for the existence of a large, undiscovered body in the outer solar system is considered robust enough by mainstream scientists to warrant dedicated telescope time and computational resources. The orbital parameters that the models predict for Planet 9, a highly elliptical orbit with a period in the range of 10,000 to 20,000 years, and a mass several times that of Earth, differ from the 3,600-year Nibiru orbit described in Sumerian tablets, but the structural similarity of a large, unseen body, following a long elliptical path through the outer solar system, is a convergence that researchers working at the intersection of these traditions have noted carefully. Military encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena have increased dramatically since 2017, with the United States government's official acknowledgement of videos showing objects that exhibit propulsion characteristics impossible for any known human-made aircraft. Craft captured on radar and on video demonstrating instantaneous acceleration, seamless transitions between atmospheric and underwater travel, and electromagnetic effects that disable electronic systems aboard military aircraft have drawn sustained attention from both official investigators and the public. Pilot testimonies, radar tracking data, and physical traces recovered from reported landing sites, including metallic residues with isotopic ratios inconsistent with terrestrial norms, together constitute a body of evidence that mainstream institutions are only beginning to take seriously. The congressional hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena that have taken place in recent years represent an extraordinary shift in the institutional response to this subject. Military and intelligence officials, who previously maintained strict silence on UAP encounters, have testified under oath to experiences and observations that, in prior decades, would have been sufficient to end a career if reported through official channels. The change in institutional culture that has allowed this shift to occur has itself been rapid and striking, moving in the space of just a few years from reflexive denial to formal investigation and public acknowledgement. Whatever the ultimate explanation for the phenomena being reported, the institutional response suggests that those with access to the most sensitive information have reached conclusions that they are only beginning to find ways to communicate to the broader public. The correlation between ancient Sumerian astronomical calculations and contemporary celestial mechanics reveals mathematical precision that validates the accuracy of ancient prophetic frameworks. Computer modeling of planetary positions during historical events described in Sumerian tablets confirms that these texts contain authentic astronomical data rather than mythological narratives. The precision of these calculations demonstrates sustained observation capabilities that conventional archaeology cannot explain through normal cultural development processes. The convergence of these contemporary phenomena with the conditions described in Sumerian prophetic texts, increased seismic and volcanic activity, accelerating magnetic pole shift, genetic engineering capabilities reaching critical thresholds, extraordinary astronomical objects moving in unusual trajectories, and widespread documentation of unidentified aerial vehicles has led some researchers to propose that the current era may represent the beginning of another of the cyclical intervention periods described in the ancient clay tablets. The preparation traditions described in the Sumerian texts are not passive waiting, but active cultivation. The tablets from the Enki temple at Eridu contain detailed protocols for what they call ascending the mountain of heaven, a consciousness expansion process conducted through specific breathing practices, acoustic treatments, and electromagnetic exposure using carefully arranged copper and iron implements. The temple complexes throughout Mesopotamia were architecturally designed to support these practices, with chambers whose dimensions were calculated to produce specific resonant frequencies when sound was introduced. The tablets record that the resonant frequency of 110 Hz, measurable in the carefully proportioned inner chambers of certain ziggurat complexes, produces documented effects in the human brain associated with enhanced intuitive and perceptual function. Modern research in the field of archaeoacoustics has confirmed that many ancient sacred sites across different cultures were constructed with similar acoustic properties, suggesting a shared understanding of the relationship between sound frequencies and altered states of consciousness. The protective practices described in the Sumerian texts involve the creation of talismanic objects from specific material combinations, incorporating precisely cut gemstones arranged in geometric patterns. These arrangements are described as channeling and redirecting energy fields in ways that provide shielding from the electromagnetic effects of advanced technology. Archaeological evidence from Sumerian temple sites has revealed buried metal objects in complex geometric configurations that produce measurable magnetic anomalies detectable with modern equipment, suggesting that the ancient practitioners had genuine and effective knowledge of electromagnetic principles and their applications. The ethical preparation described in the Sumerian texts is perhaps the most immediately accessible aspect of this tradition for a contemporary reader. The Code of Hammurabi, derived from earlier Sumerian legal teachings and described in the tablets as originating from direct Anunnaki instruction, establishes principles of justice, social responsibility, and environmental stewardship that the texts frame as prerequisites for participation in advanced galactic civilization. These principles are not presented as arbitrary rules, but as reflections of a cosmic balance that the Anunnaki describe as fundamental to the organization of intelligent life throughout the universe. Individual actions, the tablets suggest, have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate local effects, and the cultivation of truthfulness, fairness, and care for the integrity of both human communities and natural systems represents the most fundamental form of preparation for contact with beings who possess the technological means to evaluate these qualities directly. Whether or not one accepts the literal framework of extraterrestrial return and divine evaluation that these texts propose, the ethical content of this tradition offers something of genuine value to any reader who engages with it seriously. The cultivation of honesty, the practice of justice, the commitment to preserving knowledge without distorting it for personal advantage, and the maintenance of respect for the natural systems that sustain human life. These are not merely prerequisites for some hypothetical future contact event. They are the conditions for a functioning civilization, recognized as essential by the most enduring wisdom traditions of the ancient world, and as urgently needed now as at any previous moment in the long story that those ancient tablets began to tell. The ancient wisdom preserved in these texts, whatever its ultimate origin, offers a perspective on human history that is simultaneously humbling and strange and quietly wondrous. It suggests that we have been cared for, and tested, and shaped, and watched over, across a span of time so vast it barely fits within ordinary human imagining. It suggests that the story of who we are and where we came from is not yet finished. That the full picture is still unfolding, slowly, in ways that the tablets, pressed into their clay with such care so long ago, may have already anticipated. The scribes who pressed those marks into soft clay knew they were doing something that mattered. They worked by lamplight in rooms thick with the smell of damp earth, their tools moving steadily through the yielding surface, encoding in the most permanent medium available to them the knowledge that their civilization had been given, and that they were charged with passing on. They could not have known who would eventually find their work, or how many centuries would intervene between the pressing of the clay and the moment of rediscovery. They trusted that someone would come, that the tablets would endure, and that the knowledge would reach the minds it was intended to reach. In this, at least, they were not wrong. And now, as the story grows quiet around us, let these images settle gently into the soft spaces of your mind. The candle-lit scribes pressing their careful marks into clay, the wide rivers catching starlight, the ziggurats rising against the ancient sky, their upper platforms open to the wheeling heavens, where trained eyes followed the slow processional dance of stars. The first human hands, newly shaped by forces older than memory, reaching out to touch the tools that would build the first cities of the world. The long patient waiting of buried tablets, holding their knowledge safe across the centuries until we were ready to find them again. Let all of that drift peacefully now, like smoke rising from an ancient lamp into the cool still air of a Mesopotamian night, thinning and dissolving into the great darkness that surrounds all things and holds them gently in its keeping. You have traveled very far tonight, through time and mystery and the patient record of ancient voices. There is nothing more you need to understand or remember or decide. The tablets have kept their secrets for thousands of years and will continue to offer them slowly, at the pace that knowledge always moves when it is moving towards something ready to receive it. Rest now. Let it all settle softly, like silt carried by a slow river, settling down into stillness at the bottom of the current. There is nothing more you need to do or think or understand tonight. Good night and sleep well.